Hi, everyone. My name is Bronwyn Dobchuk-Land, and I'm one of the co-hosts of the evening. Welcome to the event, The Prison is Always Spreading, Carceral Spaces, Criminalization, and Abolition in the Age of Pandemics. I'll just start by letting you know how things are going to unfold this evening. After some introductions of panelists, Elle Jones will speak for around 30 minutes, followed by a 30-minute conversation among the panelists. And after that, at around 7:15, we'll open it up to audience questions. Although you can feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box anytime. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box rather than in the chat. This event is being recorded, including the Q&A period, and there's an option to post questions anonymously. Then during the last 15 minutes of the event, we are going to give Elle and the other panelists a chance to offer some closing words. So I'm now going to turn it over to one of the panelists, Chanel, to give a territorial acknowledgement.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Hi, everyone. So many of us gathered today virtually from across Turtle Island. I speak to you from Tritium Territory, which is the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, the Nahiwa, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota and Dene peoples, who prior to contact with Europeans, existed in harmony with Mother Earth, her waters, and non-human species. Just as important is the acknowledgement that Tritium Territory is also the homeland of the Métis Nation, a nation that came to be in the late 18th, early 19th century. I find it especially important to recognize and honor Treaty 3, in particular Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, which is the source of Winnipeg's clean drinking water, following installment of the aqueduct and the displacement and dispossession of land for the Anishinaabe communities who have been on boil water advisory since 1998. Alongside Treaty 3, we would like to recognize Treaty 5 territory, which is the source of Manitoba's electricity, which comes from the numerous dams that were built on Nelson River, where in the 1960s, at the direct expense of many Northern Cree and Métis communities who had been permanently dispossessed and displaced from flooding. Today, these affected communities receive little economic benefit from these destructive projects. These lands are also home to the descendants of enslaved Africans and generations of displaced and dispossessed Africans who have had to leave our ancestral homes due to the colonialism that Canada was built off of and continues to profit from. Many of us live, work, and play on territories home to Two-Spirit peoples, Indigiqueer folks, and Indigenous women and girls who are disproportionately robbed of these same opportunities. Many of us live, work, and play on territories home to Indigenous men who too are disproportionately robbed of these same opportunities. I encourage those of you who are unfamiliar with the communities who have been displaced on these territories in which you occupy to take the time to inform yourselves, and when safe enough to do so again, be informed by members of the local Indigenous communities themselves. I encourage those who are unfamiliar with communities who exist globally that are currently experiencing displacement and dispossession from their lands and are being disproportionately targeted and excluded socially, economically, and culturally, and are rather referred to statistically to educate themselves from those Black, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Palestinian communities as well.
Okay, so now I'm going to take over, sorry, and we're going to move on to introduction. So my name is Jada Hope. I go by she, her pronouns. I am an organizer with Justice for Black Lives Winnipeg and also Police Free Schools Winnipeg. So as most of you know, I was one of the organizers who put together the march last year and the rally at the Legislative in honor of Justice for Black Lives Winnipeg and just all of the people who have lost their lives to police brutality. Basically, both of those groups boil down to fighting all systems, to fighting the prison industrial complex, to fighting the military industrial complex. We are trying to abolish the police and the systems which allow them to continue and allow them to enact harm on not only Black people, but Indigenous people and essentially all people. I came into organizing just naturally, I guess I would say. I'm not an abolitionist by studying through it a lot, just basically by living through it. Living on Treaty 1, being born on this land, and also experiencing the brutality of police and just seeing how that has really affected families and how it has wrecked families and how it has affected my own family to the point where like even my grandma has bad experiences with the police and brutality at the hands of police, even being well in her 50s. It's just something that we are really trying to work against. We're really trying to fight the power that police have and just the overarching system in general, including the prison industrial complex and all actors of those systems. So this talk really fits in with that. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to share this space with the people in this space. I'm honored to be here with Elle and all of my other co-hosts, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening.
Hi, everyone. I just need to. So, Tanzi Kiawao, my name is Shana Lajwa. I use she, them pronouns. I'm an Indigiqueer artist, activist, and academic whose Métis ancestors hold roots here on Treaty 1. My art activism presents itself through printmaking, photography, and filmmaking as forms of gathering and reclaiming space for queer and Indigenous communities to which I'm proud to be a part of. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Winnipeg with a degree in urban and inner city studies, where I had the privilege to attend and complete 3 Walls to Bridges courses, which invite learning to take place on the inside of prison walls in a classroom that is shared by those who exist on the inside and those on the outside. Since graduating, I conduct various forms of student research, inclusive of freedom of information and access to information requests, and I act as an editor for essays and zines alongside my comrades and friends on the inside. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rebecca. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a white cis settler, freelance researcher and writer, and community organizer with Winnipeg Police Cause Harm, a community-centered police abolitionist organization operating out of Treaty 1 territory in so-called Winnipeg. I grew up here in so-called Winnipeg, and my maternal ancestors settled in Treaty 4 territory and near the eastern border of Treaty 1. My existence on these lands is a direct result of historical and continued dispossession and displacement of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Nakota, Lakota, and Dakota peoples. Located at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, this land is the birthplace to the Métis Nation and has always been powerful meeting grounds. I'm grateful to call this place my home, but I know my relationship with these lands will always be unsettled and uneasy. In pursuing my master's, I studied settler colonialism, and my thesis worked to conceptually disrupt the ambiguous yet often taken for granted notion of reconciliation. I do this research because I want to learn how to live on these stolen lands in a good way. As I mentioned, I also organize with Winnipeg Police Cause Harm, and I have for just about a year now. And I just wanted to speak briefly about what moved me to organize, because I think it's important for folks to hear who may be on the fence about joining a group or attending meetings. First, the Winnipeg Police Service murdered Jason Collins, Stuart Andrews, and 16-year-old Aisha Hudson in the span of 10 days last April. At that point, I didn't know what to do with my anger. But then came the sustained and powerful abolitionist organizing of Jada and the folks with Justice for Black Lives Winnipeg. After their 7 days of no peace pop-up rallies, I was incredibly energized and moved to action, and I attended a Winnipeg Police Cause Harm intake within a week of the last rally. I owe the work that I do now to Black feminist abolitionists. In a way, I feel like my work as an abolitionist is praxis. It's a way of really acting on and making real the theoretical work I did in my master's. Police are the center of what maintains the settler colonial order. They exist and have always existed and will exist until we abolish them, with the purpose to not only contain and disappear Indigenous bodies, but also to protect private property with origins, as we know, in slavery and in controlling Black bodies. And so that's how I come to the discussion tonight. And I'm just incredibly humbled to be working alongside folks on this panel and those in the audience as well. And I'm really looking forward to learning more. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for those introductions. I'll just give a little more info about myself. My name is Bronwyn, as I mentioned. My grandparents are from Scotland and Ukraine. My parents are from Shellbrook, Saskatchewan and Plumas, Manitoba, respectively. I grew up in Winnipeg. I'm broadcasting from the west end of Winnipeg here. I'm assistant professor of criminal justice at the University of Winnipeg, and I have been involved in abolitionist organizing here in Winnipeg. I although not as much as I would have liked to be during the pandemic. I have a new baby and also a toddler, and it's almost guaranteed that they're going to make appearances during this event, which I hope are not too distracting. Also, there's currently like a plumber in my house, and my backlane neighbor is blasting classic rock, so I have my windows closed and it's hot, so I'll be sweating. So, you know, like we are all just really doing this like broadcasting from a pandemic right here, right now. Before I forget, before I introduce Elle, I want to thank Kevin Walby and the Center for Access to Information and Justice for organizing this event. So now to introduce Elle, you will have read Elle Jones' bio as part of the event information you accessed in order to sign up for this event. So I won't recite it word for word, and I want to give Elle some space to introduce herself as well. But I will say that Elle is an educator, abolitionist, award-winning poet, award-winning journalist, award-winning community activist living in African Nova Scotia. Elle has done so much work before, of course, but especially during the pandemic to organize for abolition, to do so much needed public education, to produce poetry that has helped light fires of abolitionist organizing and inspiration elsewhere. And we're so excited to be in conversation with her tonight. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to Elle to speak.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Bronwyn, and to all the panelists. It's always a blessing when I'm asked to speak into Winnipeg, because I did grow up in Winnipeg. And one thing I wanted to say is that the title of this talk, I think Kevin wrote it, and it's taken from an essay I wrote in this collection of COVID work. And what I was referring to is this idea of the internal map of the prison that you develop as a geography of Canada as you visit different prisons across the country, so that my map of New Brunswick is forever conditioned by driving into Renouse week after week to visit my friend who was incarcerated there. And same thing with Spring Hill, moving across Nova Scotia, and then of course moving through the West. So growing up, I think about, you know, how often we drove past Stony Mountain or Headingley and knew that was the prison and knew that was the jail, but of course knew nothing about the people who lived inside those places. And of course, like everywhere, you can live in a city like Winnipeg and you never have any contact with a place like Stony Mountain, other than maybe, oh, that's the jail. So I just wanted to raise that as thinking about my own youth and growing up in a space that was also conditioned by the prison, as well as conditioned by, for example, anti-Indigenous racism and the geography of Winnipeg, conditioned by things like going to, you know, friends' cottages that were on Indigenous land and never being taught about or thinking about that. The high school I attended, Grant Park High School, is on a former Métis community that was eradicated. And of course, we did not know that and never talked about it. So all those absences, particularly around Indigenous history and life, and particularly around colonialism, that so much structure our space, but until we begin to look at it, we do not think of it at all. So I just wanted to say that. I'm speaking to you tonight from Halifax, Jabuktuk, the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq people, governed by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1752. I did make a PowerPoint, unusually so, and I'm just going to be honest with you that I tried to cannibalize some of the slides from my job talk. So I might skip over some of them because you know how it is when you're making a PowerPoint and then you think that's a good idea and then you realize it wasn't. But I'm going to start. So, okay, so. This quote here has haunted me for many years. It's something a young man said to me. Actually, was quoted me from one man about another young man. And this was said in a group where he said, one way or another, we all will be released. And of course, he meant either you get released through parole or you will die, or you will find some other kind of release for you. And so I want to think about that particularly in the context of COVID. In the context of us recognizing that prisons are such violent spaces, that they are never spaces that are healthy, they are never spaces that are safe, and they are always spaces that are sick. But the sickness in that space is not generated by the people who are criminalized, incarcerated. It is generated by the laws, the world, the policies outside of that prison that designate it a place where those who we care about least go to. So I just wanted that quote to sort of think through this with us. I'm going to skip all of that, but shout out to Sheila Wildman for the amazing quote. So this is just a quote by Sheila Wildman from an upcoming chapter on habeas corpus that makes the point that incarceration is not simply one moment or one event, but is a series of containments and a series of disciplines and a series of abuses that take place both inside and outside of the prison and through many different forms. I'll skip that too. I thought I had to speak for like 2 hours. That's why I made like lots of slides. So I wanted to start here for thinking about COVID with this idea of intimacy, which I think about a lot. So as I try to think about what prison means to me as someone who is not incarcerated, as someone who has the immense privilege of freedom. And of course, we can never understand our own freedom, what it means until it is taken away. And we can never understand what it is to live in unfreedom. And this is, of course, one of the main problems that people have with the notion of the prison is this idea that there has to be some punishment on top of the punishment we're already giving. So we have a constant move to treat each new abuse as first becomes normal and then becomes not enough, right? So we can think about the life sentence in Canada. This is Deborah Parks has done amazing work on this, right? Where she details how when we abolished the death penalty, we put in a life sentence, which is initially averaging 7 to 10 years. But then over time, you of course get reactions to things like somebody gets out on parole and murders somebody. And so, oh no, we have to ensure that people can't get out on parole. And gradually we creep up to 25 years as a life sentence. But then that's not enough because now that becomes normal. So then we say, well, we need some other level of incarceration for people who do even worse things. So we get things like dangerous offender, where we say, well, we have to keep some people in prison for longer. And of course, we know in Canada that the majority of dangerous offenders are Indigenous people. For men, it's about 40% of dangerous offenders. And for women, virtually every single dangerous offender who's a woman who has been designated is an Indigenous woman. And none of them committed any violent acts before they're incarcerated. So then that's not enough. So now we have things like, trying to use hate crime laws right now to make even longer sentences with this idea of using our anti-racist, anti-colonial fight against us in that sense to say that, what you need is hate crime legislation. So we look at someone like Bissonnette, and of course, this is not in any way to minimize, but we understand that giving Bissonnette a 75-year sentence or, multiple life sentences is going to be turned on to Black and Indigenous people, Muslim people the most, right? So this is another form of the idea that now the punishment we have is not enough punishment and we have to establish a different kind of punishment. And we will continue doing that because punishment is never enough. And what is normal punishment one day will always be seen as soft punishment the next day. So I think about that in terms of my own relation to abolition as well. So in my work, one of the things I guess where I was going with this is that we don't even have a word to talk about relating to people in prison. So we often default to calling it work or labor and using this kind of capitalist frame, which sort of places us in the idea that we're doing this work. But what I really want us to acknowledge, first of all, is that abolition does not belong to the academic. Abolition belongs to the people who are in prison first. They are the first abolitionists. They are the most constant abolitionists, and they are the most innovative and leading abolitionists. So in our work, we always have to think about what is the abolition work being done by people who experience incarceration the most, those who have their freedom taken from them. We also have to challenge ourselves as abolitionists to think beyond frames of innocence. There's always a desire to find some way to justify, right? So this person only stole from a Walmart, this person's pregnant, this person's a mother, this person has mental illness. And all of those things are true, but they are also this idea that we cannot simply denounce the prison. We have to find a way to establish a kind of humanity for those that we could then excuse from needing to be in that space. But the default for that is then that we can see that there are some people perhaps who need to be in prison. And this is one thing that happened during COVID that was extremely harmful to people inside was, for example, in our province, and I know Sheila Wildman is on this talk, and Sheila was an extremely important leader in doing this. I mean, Sheila wrote individual letters to dozens of people. In our first wave of COVID, we released 41% of people in prison, provincial jail, I mean, not prison, in the provincial jail. And the world did not end. There was not a crime wave. The city did not collapse, proving to us that the prison is an imaginary space and that we actually do not need to depend upon punishment. And our belief that jail is somehow necessary is totally blown into pieces by the idea that we could let out almost half the jail and at much less of the cost. But within that, there were some people that could not get out of jail, including people that were waiting trial on manufactured violent charges, such as a jail fight that our crowns have decided to prosecute as an attempted murder and conspiracy to murder so they can deny people access to bail. And so those people discussed what it meant to see the doors opening of the prison, but they could never walk through it. So every day, more and more people were going through the community. And then there were other people on immigration detention who weren't to be trusted to be in community because they were flight risks. People awaiting charges that may not be borne out, but have now sat inside cells at risk of death of COVID for over a year and more as they await trial, which of course now those trial dates, waiting dates are so long. So people are serving, 2-3 years now before they're even getting sentenced. And so that was very painful for them. The idea that we created a notion there were some people we can advocate for and some people we can't. And of course we had to strategically advocate. So we said things like elderly prisoners, those with nonviolent crimes, those close to release. And we had to do that. I'm not critiquing that we had to do that. We had to try and get people out. But the backlash of that came on to those that then said, okay, so I'm the person who's left to die. So this is all by way of saying that in my own mind, in the end, the only solution I have thought to describe what it is that we do is to think about intimacy and love. The thing that the prison wants the least, the thing that the prison is designed to repel in every single way. And so what's interesting about this is that it is a fear of intimacy that kind of animates COVID and this idea that we can't be close to each other, we can't breathe on each other, we can't cough on each other, but yet like at the same time, those intimacies are something that is always denied by the prison. I'll say what I'm saying here. So on the left, we have a picture of Sarah Tessier. And I want to pause here and say that the first thing I think of in seeing Sarah Tessier is that this woman who served many, many years in federal prison, who is in this slideshow because she is leading a lawsuit by women in Nova who were raped by one of the male guards. So a number of women are now suing Nova Institution, which is on the right, for being sexually assaulted by a guard. And Sarah is the woman who bravely stood up to speak about this. As she is fighting this, I want to tell you about what kind of woman Sarah is. And this is my point about the beauties of intimacy. Sarah called me up one day and asked me, she knows I like cats. And she said, like, boy or girl? And I was like, huh? And then she's like, oh, I have a cat for you. I got you a girl cat. And then we drove weeks later as the cat was ready to leave its mother. She drove me up to the place where she had got this cat for me. And I always remember driving home, holding this cat that was, shaking in my arms as I transported it and feeling responsible for this life that was now in my hands and thinking about how Sarah wanted to give me this particular gift of life and this particular gift of care and just saying, I think you deserve a cat right now. So that's an example of the kind of beautiful transformative intimacy we experience when we work or live with or love with people who are inside. But the reason also why I want to draw up this slide is because I was actually kicked out of Nova. I used to go into Nova to write with a woman. I was doing writing workshops. And at first they let me go up to the maximum unit and talk to the woman. And, I had to meet one-on-one. And we would actually have moments where, the woman would be writing on the chalkboard in the maximum unit because there wasn't a lot of paper and be writing poems about, so many really personal things that they were experiencing that they had a space to live in. And then they stopped letting me go up there, mostly because I sent women stuff for one of her packages and you're not really supposed to do that. So then they made me do it in the visiting area where they could survey me. And I happened to see one of the women and I said, how are you doing? What's going on? As you're walking through. And she said, oh, I just broke up with my girlfriend. And I said something along the lines of, that's too bad, but you can take time for yourself and, love yourself, whatever you would say to somebody. And I was accused of illegally counseling the woman because in order to have that human conversation with the woman, just to say, the same thing you would say to anybody, they're like, you're not a professional counselor. You're not in a position to talk to the woman. I was also accused of violating intimacy because we would hug after we had a writing workshop. And so when my visiting form came up, they simply lost it. And, just kept telling me that they just couldn't find my form. And then it became obvious that they were no longer allowing me in. I say this because that was taking place at the exact same time as a guard was sexually assaulting women in this prison. So while I was being removed from the prison ostensibly because I was touching and hugging women, also because they thought I was a gang member. It later turned out that they thought I was both a blood and a Hell's Angel. So, who knows what's going on in a prison at any one time. But as they're ostensibly saying, well, you're giving women your number to call you when they get out, and you're not allowed to do that as a volunteer. And, you touched a woman and, you counseled a woman, a guard was raping women. So I want us to think about, that's where I go with this idea of intimacy, like how prisons abuse their closeness, the strip search every day, right? in Burnside, my local provincial prison, initially both the men and the women were strip searched when coming for methadone every single day. The women successfully, Elizabeth Fry advocated for the women not to be strip searched, but the men continued to be strip searched. That is what I would say is an abuse of intimacy. This idea that anything that is human will be removed from the prison. Anything that is about love and closeness and kindness will be moved from the prison, but sexual assault will remain, the strip search will remain, the surveillance will remain. So these very intimate forms of violation that take place. If you're visiting, for example, and you want to have an intimate visit with a partner, they will pull out your bag, they will scan your sex toys, your lube, your medications, you will have no bodily privacy. And that is a condition of going into the prison. And they will also, of course, police whether or not you're a worthy visitor to start with. So when you look at CSC's policy on visiting, they talk about how visiting is a moral kind of position. They want people that will uplift and improve the prisoner. So that doesn't mean somebody who supported you while you used drugs while you lived on the streets. It may not mean somebody who has a criminal record, but also has been the person that has most intimately known you and lived with you. So the designation even of who can be a friend, who can be an intimate partner, and who is seen as worthy of visiting or being part of your life is very much controlled through CSC, through very colonial ideas of who's appropriate, through, of course, very hetero ideas, through very moralistic and conservative ideas. So even at that level, you are policed. But at the same time, as I said, prisoners are constantly violating people. And of course, it's relevant to COVID because the solution that prisons had in COVID was not to release people. It wasn't to say, let's make sure that we get all federal prisoners out, that we can get out. It was to move into greater lockdown. And again, I return, like I said, with punishment to this idea of the new normal. So for a long time, we have seen an increase in Canadian prisons and jails of lockdown and surveillance techniques. So people used to be out 12 hours a day, then it changed to 8, then it changed to 4. Now you're lucky if you're out for 2. And that's considered a good day, right? If you're out for 3 or 4 hours a day, like that's amazing. You're not locked down. And that used to be constrained, but that has become normal. And what our jails and prisons did in COVID was not seek a new relation to community, not think about what it means that it's staff bringing in this virus and what that means about the general abusive relationship of staff to prisoners, and that even without a virus, how does staff relate violently to prisoners? There was none of that reckoning, of course. There was just lock people up and let's make more security, and we can somehow securitize our way out of this pandemic. Which is very similar, of course, to response on the streets, where we believed that we could somehow police away the pandemic. And so, of course, we saw people calling the police largely upon Black and Indigenous people. And of course, we saw this increased amount, not new, but even more police shootings as a result as well. So the response in jails to this disease has been to lock down, to deprive. Visits, of course, have been locked off in virtually every prison and jail in this country, and every prison in this jail in this country for months. Video visiting, which they only sort of allow in certain ways and which usually don't work, and you have to have the right technologies. Those are also highly monitored technologies. The agreement that our province has with Telmate, for example, who runs our phones, if you ever look at the user agreement on the tablets that you need for visiting, it says that they can use your biometric data, they can use your fingerprint, they can use your face data, and they can sell all of that to law enforcement officials across North America. So the cost of a visit is giving up your quite literal personal data into databases that will then be used to criminalize even more people, because what they want that data for is to form tables and data tables in order to, continue to like predict and police crime. So yeah, there's been no visits, there have been no lawyers allowed in, there have been no programs, there's been nothing. What there has been is lockdown. And that, of course, has led to increased overdoses within the prisons, increased drug use, obviously increased mental health problems, like violence, and then, of course, always met by repression. So this here on the right is you can't see it very well, it's a crap picture I took, but what it is the dress code at Renouse. So this was inflicted upon me visiting. They love to hand it out to all the young women visiting in particular. So for men, you can't really see what it says on this page. You can see the length of it. For men, that dress code is pretty much no mesh shirts. Like that's like literally anything for the men. They're like, don't wear a mesh shirt. For women, it's nothing tight, but also you can't wear anything baggy with pockets or a hood because you could be hiding something in that. Nothing see-through, but nothing layered. So you can't wear a cardigan over a tank top. You have to have sleeves. So you can imagine in the summer, your skirt has to come down to your knees and they can keep you out. So this is like the old like school thing of kneeling as your skirt rides up. No high heels, no open-toed shoes, no scents and perfume, no excessive jewelry. One of my friends said they should basically make a business of selling women visiting tents because obviously like that's the only thing they want you to wear. And when I once questioned this dress code, I was told there's rapists in here and we're just trying to keep women safe. And then of course I thought about having an argument with the guard about like, people don't rape people because of what they're wearing. But obviously I wanted to get in and visit and not argue with the guards. So I smiled and, kept it moving because obviously the people on the reception desk have the power to ban you from a visit. When you visit, you are only allowed a hug at the beginning of the visit and at the end of the visit. And other than that, any touching is like illegitimate. At Spring Hill, there was a guard that used to quite literally get on the microphone in the visiting room and call the names of people that she felt were touching others inappropriately, as in like young couples that might, someone might put a hand on a leg, and she would do this like public embarrassment in the room to people who were touching in inappropriate ways. So, I have sat in visits where people are crying and you can't even reach out to touch their hand because to do so would end the visit. And I got put on a list for that kind of thing too. So you see a pattern here. Anytime you engage in human contact, you get put on a little surveillance behavior list, which then they can use to block you, ban you, lecture you. You get pulled aside to be lectured about your behavior. So I just say this about the dress code as another example of the ways that prisons consistently abuse this idea of like the visit, coming in just to be in contact with someone, coming in to love somebody, coming in to just share something. And in order to do that, there's this fear of like women might bring sexuality into this place. What if there's desire? What if these people want to have sex with each other? Oh no, so we have to police that. And they do this through the dress code. So this is just another absurd example. And as I said, they do all of this at the same time as they are beating women who are pregnant and pepper spraying them, at the same time as they're strip searching people and violating their rights, at the same time as they're, kneeling on people experiencing mental health issues, and at the same time as they're consistently, working to do everything they can to stop all kinds of flow of information, and whether that's blocking packages of mail. I once got mail blocked because I was sending too much paper and it was a fire hazard, just to give you an idea of the kind of rhetoric you experience. And then I was like, how is paper a fire hazard? And they're like, well, not everybody has common sense in here. Like some people might get paper and light it on fire. I'm like, isn't that disclosure files? Like, how does that even make any sense, right? So any kind of excuse will be used to bar you from communicating with people, up to and including, of course, the predatory phone system, which is run by, in our case, provincially Telmate, American company. I mentioned they, sell your data everywhere, another abuse of intimacy and privacy. But of course, these phone companies charge, ridiculous amounts of money. It used to be $10 a call here. We got it down, but through call packages. But that, of course, means you have to have access to the internet. You have to have access to a credit card, things that many, many people don't have. So one of the calls I often get is like, my girl's going to send you $20. Can you put $20 on my phone? And then I'm like, don't send me the 20. I'll just put it on the phone, But people just trying to have some kind of communication barred by making the phone system into a business that, of course, exploits people. And many prisoners have been speaking out about this. Bell, of course, many people now have spoken about how Bell Let's Talk, operates as Bell has an exclusive phone monopoly on federal prisons. This is a picture of Jeremy Weeks. This is just going to my point about prison's fear of intimacy. I don't know if people remember Jeremy Weeks. Do you remember Prison Bay at all? This is one of my favorite things. So you might remember this is from like 2015, and this is was like a phenomenon. So Jeremy Weeks, who's known as Prison Bay, this was his mugshot, and it was posted, and women, like hetero women, obviously, and some gay men too, gay men as well, found Jeremy Weeks very attractive. And so people began posting, because this is something that police departments love to do, especially in the States, right? They'll do like mugshot Mondays or, like wanted Wednesdays. And it's obviously intended as a form of public humiliation. So they'll put up the pictures of people. Often they try and put up, the worst looking mugshot. So often, of course, meaning people with disabilities, people suffering with addiction, people who are recently homeless. And those pictures are put up, and then people laugh about, oh, look at the faces of meth, or, oh my gosh, look at, that girl's face, right? So a very cruel and public shaming activity undertaken by police departments. So they put up this picture of Jeremy Weeks on like Warren Wednesday or whatever it was, and people began posting how hot he was. And then they were like, he can break and enter me anytime, and he's committed a robbery of my heart. And the police couldn't handle that. the idea that they put up this picture to shame somebody, and then people intervened in a different way and said, actually, we find that person attractive. In other words, this person is a human being, and you shouldn't have to earn your human being through being, you know, hot, but such as it was. So the police began saying, oh no, like, look at, he's a gang member, like he has a long list of violent crimes, and literally put up a post shaming people responding to finding this picture attractive, basically being like, how dare you, this man is actually a criminal. And then all the women responded by being like, we'd rather have sex with him than like you know, like you're, then they went in on the cops, and it was that, you know, people like, go eat another donut, pig, and all this stuff. And it was, I always thought it was really funny because it was an intervention of desire into this shaming space where people just were like, no, we're actually not going to accept your narrative about this person. And we have another narrative, and we get to find this person attractive. And then, of course, there was an infantilization of straight women as a result, this idea. So I saw these articles where they'd be like, some women desire murderers, you know, and implying that to find somebody attractive is a kind of pathology, right? And also an infantilizing of women around this idea that women don't know our own minds or desires or bodies, and like women somehow have to be protected, particularly patriarchally protected by authorities like the police, from our own desires. So that's just a moment I've always found funny, but it tells us something again, right, about what a prison is really here to do, because it does nothing to the police if we find Jeremy Weeks attractive or not, but they could not allow that to happen, because to allow that to happen might also allow us to express other forms of humanity within that space. Here's Randy Riley. I want to talk, and this is going to the issue of thinking about leading abolitionists in Canada. Randy Riley is a wrongfully convicted African Nova Scotian man. He was convicted of the murder of Chad Smith, who is white. He was convicted despite the fact that somebody else confessed to the crime on the stand. He was convicted despite the fact that there was no forensic evidence. And he was, of course, convicted by an all-white jury, which took 5 days to come to a verdict and couldn't even read the verdict correctly. During that case, we experienced all kinds of racism, blatant, and like, when I say racism, I mean blatant, overt racism from the Crown, who I'll name, Melanie Perry, who, you know, went down into the cells and said, you know, I'll see you in 25 years on the day that somebody else confessed to the crime, who told the media that the white family was not able to come to court because we, the Black people, were intimidating and threatening them, when in fact people had hugged in the hallway with each other and said, you know, this is very difficult for everybody, because people in these circumstances find ways to have other forms of communication. So the mother of Chad Smith had come over to me and said, you know, I noticed that the courtroom is like Black people on one side and white people on the other side. You know, I just want to like acknowledge that, and that's not what this is about. You know, we're all just trying to get through this, and hugged me. And then you have the Crown coming in and saying, oh, you know, these Black people are violent and they're threatening the family, and creating this whole other narrative. We had media do stuff like not attend court for the entire of the defense case because they went over to another courtroom, but report that Randy was staring at the witness, trying to imply that he was threatening or violent. So this is the context in which this young man got convicted, and he has spent 8 years in prison. He just turned 30 this year, so he spent his entire 30s in prison. It, of course, later emerged that the one witness they had has now retracted his testimony and said that he was coerced. He was paid $18,000 by the police, and they told him, you can either be a witness or you can be the perpetrator, you can be the suspect, choose. So he chose to be a witness. The cop lied on the stand. Crown hid disclosure in their files. Evidence went missing. All of this in the context of this conviction. But the reason why I have Randy up here is because Randy is probably the most important abolitionist I know. While Randy has been incarcerated, Randy has organized prisoners in so many important and amazing ways. He was one of the organizers of Black Power Hour, which is our radio show. He's a co-founder of that. That is a radio show that provides political, social, and cultural commentary. So we do it through its community radio. It's directed at prisoners because, again, like I said, prisons don't like any kind of intimacy. They persistently tune the communal TVs to the channel that our show is on, so that they can block people listening to it. So it's only like available from certain cells. So this is the kind of moves the prison makes. People are able to call in. Many of them share their own work, their own voices, and many of them use the space to advocate for each other. So there's many times when, like, especially on the women's side, they'll call up and be like, there's a woman here, like she's being held without a mattress, like, can you help her? So use it as a kind of public space of advocacy. This is also the place where we organized the prison strike from. Oh, sorry, wrong thing. This is the prison strike. So this is in 2018 the Burnside prison strike. What this slide shows is our posters for the strike, which are based upon the work of Amos Kennedy, who's a Black Southern United States printer who often prints upon like maps of the South in order to like interrupt the geography of racism and slavery and stuff like that. So we consciously chose to base it on that. So Randy was the lead organizer of the prison strike, which required people to organize across multiple ranges. And one of the things they did during that strike was simply organize that nobody would take a level. So that meant everybody had to essentially take any abuse the guards wanted to give out, like not do anything so that nobody in the entire jail got disciplined for 3 weeks. And they did that as an act of solidarity in order to support the strike. And then the final day they refused to lock up and people came to the prison and stood outside the gates and just held banners and said, we love you. And then, of course, all those people got arrested. But many people have described that as the best day they had inside jail. And Randy was a leader of that organization. I want to raise this idea of prison strikes because throughout COVID, we have seen these strikes growing across Canada. So in Laval, we saw people held on immigration detention strike. We've seen strikes inside Warkworth, strikes inside Collins Bay. And of course, these strikes have been met by incredible repression, by guards putting up and administrators putting up posters saying, I'm going to shut this place down and treat it like the shoe. People being transferred out, as always happens. People, facing threats, people having their phone time cut and getting their phones taken away from them for 3 months. Being sent across the country. All these retaliations that have happened in response to people trying to organize. In Joyceville, I believe it was, they promised the prisoners that they would meet their demands and people stopped striking, and then they promptly disciplined everybody. So we see these kind of acts. So related to COVID has also been incredible acts of resistance by people who are inside. Okay, no, I don't need that. I just wanted to flip back to this for Randy, just because I want to point out something about the media here. So on the left, this is an episode of the show Halifax Homicide that does true crime, trying to base upon this fetish that we now have for true crime podcasts. So it's as Randy's undergoing appeal, this is being placed on our airwaves in Halifax, which is a recounting of a murder that, they attribute to him. So this is the narrative that he has to contend with in public. And on the right is just Randy hanging out in his yard on bail, because we did get Randy out after 8 years. We were able to, he won the first part of his appeal at the Supreme Court. And so he is on bail, and that is actually in his yard in Cherrybrook, a historic Black community. And he's hanging out with his mosquito mask. So he sent me that and I laughed for about 5 minutes at him. But it is, he's living in freedom such as it is, but it is still not freedom, right? He's on bail. He's able to be out in the sunshine in his yard, but he has a surveillance bracelet. He is still facing trial in October, and it will be another white jury, and it's a white crown that is just as vicious, and he may well be reconvicted, even though they have no witnesses, even though everything's been recanted. That means nothing in Nova Scotia when we have years and years and years of white supremacy to draw upon. And what I also think about with Randy is the first day he was out, I came up to see him. He lives about 20 minutes from me. And like I said, he lives in a historic Black community. While he was incarcerated, his mother passed, and he had come out on the day of his mother's funeral. And we had to fight to get him out. And they wouldn't let him come in his own clothes. They made him come in prison orange, and they shackled him, which they're not supposed to do. But nobody was going to really fight it because we just wanted him out. So in the end, we were just let's just get him out. So he came to the church in his community where his mother was being buried, and he wanted to speak. He's the oldest child in his family. And they had to bring the microphone to him because the guards wouldn't let him come up. And so he's standing there in orange, and he said, "I'm sorry to come before you like this." And then the church started saying, "We love you. You are our child." People started yelling this out, as he was speaking. People began speaking. I'm getting teared up because it was so powerful. As he's standing there with guards, people in this church who were mourning his mother started saying, "We love you. You are our child. You are home." And the guards couldn't do anything. So even though he wasn't supposed to touch people, people began coming up to him and putting their hands on him and hugging him. And the guards realized there's nothing we can do. The sheriffs realized, and they just stepped back and they let people love each other. People brought his children to him. He hadn't held one of his daughters for years. He'd never seen her. She was born after he went to prison. And people put his daughters in his arms. And it was the most beautiful example of a community that does not have the word abolition. I don't think anybody in that community would define themselves as a defunder of the police or abolitionists or even in political ways. They're ordinary Black people, but they live a political life. They live in a historic Black community founded by enslaved people, and they understood instinctually what that moment meant. And they created in that space a moment of community abolition that the prison could not fight against. The prison had no power when it came to that. So I think about that. And then when Randy got out on the first day, I drove up to see him and we went to his mother's grave. But going to his mother's grave, we had to pass through the whole community. So we're driving through the road and every house is a relative of his and we have to get out and go into their house and like saw these like old women and, you know, you have to drink tea and everybody's curious about who I am and what's happening. And, you know, as we moved house to house in this kind of procession towards his mother's grave, which is in this ancestral graveyard of generations of Black people buried in this yard. And so we walked through these graves of his ancestors for generations back. And then we came back to the house and people just kept coming. They kept coming in. And it was men bringing clothes and talking about like, I can't believe I'm shopping for another man, but I went and got you clothes. And people bringing things to the house. And his aunts are cooking in the kitchen. All food is just everywhere. And people are outside barbecuing and cars just coming and coming and coming because people were celebrating the freedom such as it was of this man within this community. And that to me is abolition. That to me is what we work towards. That feeling, that moment sitting in that kitchen, you know, and people were joking back and forth and other men coming. I remember one of his cousins came in and he had also been incarcerated and just paused as everyone's laughing and joking. And he said, we made it out. We made it out. And I thought, isn't that the Black condition, right? We've made it out of slavery. We've made it out of, you know, so many violent situations, out of colonialism, out of countries that try to kill us. We try to make it out. And in this moment, these two people who looked at themselves and understood freedom and looked at each other and just said, you know, we made it out. So I just wanted to think about that. I'm going to skip through. I'm taking too long. This is just a picture of Corey Rogers. I wanted to raise this because in the context of, there's a tendency in COVID for us to think that COVID is providing us something new, that, you know, prisons are bad now because of COVID. Corey Rogers died in the cells like he was taken in for drunkenness. They put a spit hood on him and did not check on him and he asphyxiated on his own vomit and died. And, you know, the cops were initially convicted. They've appealed and have like been successfully appealed. So like they get off, nobody else does. I don't believe that prison is a solution. I don't believe in prison for anybody, including cops, but we can still recognize, of course, the injustices that take place. Corey here, I just think about, you know, Corey was breathing, you know, and inhaled his own vomit and that killed him. And this idea of putting a spit hood on this person to cut off that you know, literally like those dog collars so that he can't spit on them. This goes back to this fear of intimacy. We had an emergency room doctor here in Nova Scotia who works in Cape Breton write an editorial in the paper and said that he sympathized with the cops that killed Corey because he works in an emergency room and drug addicts come in all the time and spit on him and he could get AIDS. And, you know, he might actually get spit on one day and use this absolutely disgusting, dehumanizing language about people who are drug users, people who are criminalized. And when that was complained about, when we were like, surely it's not inappropriate for a doctor to speak this way about anybody, to dehumanize people in this way, it was fine. That complaint went nowhere. He's allowed to say those things because prisoners are not seen as human beings. The last thing I want to say, because I realize I'm running out of time, I wanted to just talk about Fatuma for a minute. And I realize this talk's supposed to be about COVID and we can talk about that more in the questions. There's a lot. But the reason why I also don't like necessarily focusing on COVID is because then it allows us to manufacture a crisis moment. This idea that something unusual is happening in this moment. Whereas those of us who have, you know, engaged with the prison for any length of time know that all that is happening is perhaps an acceleration and, you know, consolidation of policies, but everything that is happening has already happened, is already happening. And like I said, there is no pre-time when the prison was better. There is no pre-time before COVID when we imagined a healthy prison or a safe prison or an uninfected prison. That does not exist. So COVID accelerates these things, but all it does is give a justification for practices that have always been lurking and have always been present. You know, whether that, and of course, particularly the renaming of abuse as safety, right? So this is something we do in Canada in particular. All colonial nations do this. Lisa Lowe calls this the ontology of forgetting, right? That all settler colonial nations are based upon an ontology of forgetting that begins with the fundamental forgetting of Indigenous genocide upon which we are founded. And of course, the bodies of the children were just found at residential school in Kamloops, you know, creating this kind of pretend shock when Indigenous people have been saying for years that they saw open graves, that children disappeared, that they had friends who died. And of course, we had to manufacture all kinds of outrage when the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report came out around using the word genocide, and then pretend that we're shocked that genocide is taking place and children are actually killed in residential schools, which, as many people have pointed out, to use the word school, perhaps a better word would be death camp or death prison. Although also, it's not like schools also aren't carceral spaces. Where was I going with this? I'm sorry, I got distracted from myself by talking because I got angry about the residential schools. But yeah, I was saying that like to imagine that this is not already a space, that there is no connection between 215 dead Indigenous children and the 44% of Indigenous women in federal prison is to pretend that we don't carry this violence forward. So I think it's really important that we don't present COVID as a kind of new iteration of something. COVID is no different. It's just providing a route for them to rename lockdown as safety and health. But we already do this. We've renamed solitary confinement structural intervention units and then made them worse. And every single person who is involved in those units will tell you that it's actually worse than solitary confinement was, because at least in solitary confinement, you were entitled to reviews. Now, since they're not calling it solitary confinement, they get to be kept there longer. There's no schedule of letting people out. What they claimed was going to happen, oh, they're going to have meaningful contact, hasn't happened. And we've also seen those units spread into like provincial prisons. So we have in Halifax what they call the Behavioral Intervention Direct Unit. I don't know, some awful Orwellian name, which people have repeatedly taken to court to try and get declared solitary confinement, and judges just accept it because the guards come in and the admin comes in and they say, oh no, all these people are badly behaved. And it very much harkens back to case management they used to apply on the women. I mean, they still do, but so this was this idea that they would put women on like a level system and say, you know, you have to earn toilet paper, you have to earn the right to clean the floor of your cell, you have to earn a tampon. And the earning it was by behaving well. And women didn't know what that meant. So, you know, you could behave and then roll your eyes at a guard and be told that you were rolling your eyes and go right back to you know, being on like the first level again. You might curse, you might maybe get frustrated and hit a wall. And then this was justification. So that people never knew if they were getting let out. They never knew when they were getting let out. They never knew what arbitrary behavior. It was extremely gendered because there's never like a man that's going to get punished for rolling his eyes or sucking his teeth or saying fuck, but like the women were getting punished for this. So this kind of idea of like these behavioral units very much harkens back to this idea of just creating a kind of indefinite incarceration in the name of safety. So we like to rename these things, right? So solitary confinement at Nova is now called Unit B. So I guess there's no solitary confinement, there's just Unit B. You know, the residential school is just renamed and reiterates itself into the prison. And now it's just, you know, incarcerated Indigenous people. Black death is reincarnated over and over and over again in our urban space, right? So I go back to, you know, walking through the graveyard with Randy, but, you know, how that space of the Black graveyard is always uncovered to the extent of Black graves like rising up in places like Wall Street to remind us that this capitalist system is founded upon the graves of these dead bodies. I say all of this to just point towards Fatuma in a kind of roundabout way. This is Fatuma at a town hall, as it says, with Justin Trudeau. This is when we were fighting the deportation of Abdul Abdi. And this is the moment where Fatuma stood up in front of the Prime Minister. She was 6 months pregnant. She was on a high-risk pregnancy. She herself has no citizenship to this day. She was threatened. She didn't tell me this until like last year, but while she was fighting the deportation of her brother, she was threatened by CBSA agents that they would deport her, even though she has committed no crime. So there was nothing to deport her for, but they threatened her. And she remains under the clutches of social services. So I know I'm taking a bit long, but I want to tell you a bit about Fatuma, about this amazing woman. Fatuma stood in front of Justin Trudeau and asked him, why are you deporting my brother? Would you deport your own child? And then stood and looked him down as Justin Trudeau tried to explain why this is fairness and process. And this sparked a movement in Canada because the next night in Hamilton, somebody else stood up and asked Justin Trudeau about this. And many, many children who had been in care, because Fatuma and Abdul were child refugees who came to Nova Scotia and were taken into the permanent care system. They did not speak any English. They were not offered a translator. To this day, the family does not know why Abdul and Fatuma were taken. Fatuma remembers the police coming to her house and, you know, screaming and just being put in this police car. Fatuma was stripped of her hijab and was never given another one. When Fatuma and Abdul spoke Somali to each other in the child's group home, they were removed and taken into separate rooms so that they could not communicate because the staff believed that they were plotting to escape. And then they were placed into an abusive foster home where Fatuma told them, you know, we are from rival tribes, like these people, we are ancestral enemies. And they said, oh, you're all black. It's a black home, and dumped them on the doorstep and left them. And the children suffered grotesque sexual and physical abuse in that home. After a year, Fatuma was removed from that home. Abdul was left there for 3 more years. Fatuma was removed because her sister saw the signs of abuse. One of the early criminal contacts Abdul had while living in that home was he stole the family car in order to drive around the city to try and find his sister. His aunt applied for citizenship on their behalf, and they said, you're not the guardian of these children, and removed the children. So they never got citizenship. And that, of course, meant that when Abdul turned 19 and committed a crime, he was eligible for deportation. And so they tried to send him back to Somalia. And this is at the point where we intervened. There's a longer story behind this I don't have time for that also involves Ashley Smith's family. Ashley Smith, of course, died in GVI. They will claim by suicide. Ashley was not suicidal. She wrapped a sheet around her neck. Her family, of course, know and believe that she was trying to seek sensation and human contact in that moment. It's Ashley's nephew that actually called me about Abdul while he was incarcerated, and his family were the people that really put us in contact and began that. So another incarcerated person, people that understood this legacy of incarceration. And we can think about how Ashley Smith has family members who are incarcerated, who know that their niece died in jail. There's actually a cell in Burnside that's known as Corey's cell, because when he was found out that Ashley had been killed inside GVI, he was in the cell, and he went, like, he freaked out. Of course he did. He was so all he could do was like destroy the cell. So they started putting bars on it, and it's like literally like a tank. It's like an iron cell, and people will tell you I'm in that cell, and everyone knows where this cell came from. It came from somebody protesting their family member being killed by guards and like not wanting to take it and fighting back any way they could, and the jail responding by basically creating a reinforced steel cell where they can lock people in, and now they send people to that cell all the time. So if you're like badly behaved, you end up in this cell created for this reason. It's absolutely disgusting. So think about what that means to Ashley Smith's family, to know that this happened to somebody in their family, and then to be incarcerated themselves, and to be incarcerated themselves and still fighting for other people who are incarcerated and being deported, which is Jordan fighting for Abdul. So I'm saying this in the context of abolition because I believe that Fatuma, along with Randy, these are the people who structure the abolition in my life. Fatuma has no power. Fatuma remains in the clutches of social services. Fatuma had a child killed by social services because when Abdul was arrested, they came and took Fatuma's children from her, last remaining child that they already hadn't taken from her. And she said, this child needs constant care. He was living with a disability. And they ignored her. And as she visited him and said, there are scratches on his face, there are bruises on him, they ignored her, and that child died. He was basically murdered in child services, and they did not even give him a headstone. She does not even know where her own child is buried. And this woman, coming out of that condition, is standing in front of our prime minister and saying, why are you deporting my brother? It's such a powerful moment. So the last thing I'll say, because I know I'm running out of time, I'm talking really, really long. Oh my God, I'm talking super long. You should shut me up. So the last thing I'll say is, I always hold to myself when I think about what this work means and why we are here and what our purpose is. I think about the first time I saw Abdul after his deportation was stopped. And everybody told us you can't stop a deportation in Canada. Once those wheels grind, there's nowhere to go. And everybody from Abdul's lawyer who took it to court to the people across Canada who just stepped up and fought for Abdul, we just rejected that. We just refused that. And we were like, we're going to fight with every breath in our body. We literally had conversations with each other like, who's going to fly to Somalia if they deport this man? Because we're going to have to get him out to Germany. We're like, Adil, like you speak Somali, like you go, we literally talked about, will we drain our bank accounts? There's a point where they had him out at a CBSA jail outside of an airstrip where they have their own airport. And we were so terrified they would deport him from there that we made plans to drive there. Like, you guys drive from Toronto, I'll drive from Halifax, we'll meet and we'll lie down on that runway and we'll probably get 5 years. Like we were serious about this because we were like, we are going to fight everything we have. Every breath in our body, we're going to fight for this young man. And it never came to that. So everything else we had to do seemed relatively easy compared to what the risks we were willing to take. But because we took those risks together, led by Fatuma, when Abdul was freed, I saw Abdul in Toronto. And I always say that I've never felt as much joy in my life as I did as when I saw Abdul and he saw me and we ran towards each other. It was like a movie, you know, we ran towards each other and he picked me up off my feet and swung me around. And the joy that I felt in that moment is as powerful as anything I felt in my whole life. So when I ask myself, you know, why do we do this work? Why is it, you know, that we every day wade into this space where we hear the most horrific things, the worst conditions you can imagine, the kinds of testimonies you hear, like people calling you up, people losing their babies, people calling you up and talking about being raped. You know, people have never disclosed sexual assault, disclosing it to you over a recorded prison phone because they have nowhere else to tell. You know, people advocating for each other and being like, I don't want anything for myself, but there's a guy in here and he's like a migrant from Jamaica and his skin is like erupting and it's horrible and he's itchy. Like, can you do something? You know, people calling for each other all over the place. And when I think about why do we do that? Like, why do we do that? I think because freedom is a possibility, because Abdul picked me up in Toronto and spun me around, and because we can do this work, because as hard and as sad as it is, as much you know, grief it brings us, we are not the ones that are at the center of that. There are other people at the center of that. We can always choose to walk away. I can decide not to pick up the phone tomorrow if I'm tired or I'm just over it or I have something else to do. And there's nothing anybody who's incarcerated can do about that. They can't force me. So we have to make that choice and commitment every single day in ourselves to make a choice to come into that space of people who have no choice to be there. And the reason why we do it and what is abolition drives with us is because we believe that possibility of freedom is there, because we can get 41% of people out of our provincial jail, because we can stop the deportation, because we can join together with prisoners on a hunger strike, and because we can and must continue to fight this idea that there are people who deserve to be punished, and that there are places that whatever, however we dice it, there are some people who need to be placed in these prisons. And I reject that. And I continue to reject that throughout my life. And what it has brought me in rejecting it has been the love of people like Fatuma. I know I'm going really long, so I will stop there. I know we have a panel. I'm so sorry to go so long, Bronwyn. You shouldn't have let me. I feel like I took up a lot of space and I didn't mean to take up.
Are you kidding? Like, thank you, Elle. That was incredibly moving and powerful. And I would never dream of asking you to stop talking. That was amazing. Thank you. This idea that abolition is about intimacy and love, about working to breach the attempts of the prison and policing and carceral infrastructure more broadly to repel love and intimacy and caring, that is so powerful, and it rings so true. And it actually reminds me of part of a blog post by Jada, one of our panelists. And I'll just mention, I think if you're on the panel, you can turn your video on. So Jada wrote a blog post on the Winnipeg Police Cause Harm website where she says, and this is annotated, "No one's asking for funding to be ripped away from police just because the police are not well liked. We need abolition because our community on Treaty 1 territory deserves love, resources, and support instead of racist, deadly, and overall ineffective policing." So those are Jada's words. And I'm really looking forward to a conversation now about how this plays out in our abolitionist organizing. And I just want to say, like, I really appreciate the feeling that is like brought into this conversation now. Just a reminder about format, we're going to start with a round of questions or comments from the other panelists, and then we'll get to audience questions, which you can post at any time in the Q&A box. So we're going to start with Jada. Thanks again, Elle.
Yes, Elle, this talk it's been great. I haven't been able to attend a lot of these, so it's great to be able to listen to you and have you speak for the time that you did. And it was just also heartfelt. I think the thing that might separate me a little bit just from like other people in the city and the work that they do is, for me, abolition, just like you said, it's always been based in love, and it has to be that first. Otherwise, there's no point. Otherwise, you are going to start criminalizing certain people, and you're not going to be able to get that point across and to have the achievements that you want to have. It's way less about academic language and the rhetoric that's used, and it's much more about intimacy, community, and just overwhelming amounts of love. So I guess I'm just wondering, in your experience, what is the best way to live this out, both in your own personal community and then try to bridge that gap between our incarcerated kin, and try to incorporate them into your daily lives as well? Just what's the best recommendation for how we can do that?
That's a question for me? Oh, okay.
Yes.
I always say that abolition is a daily commitment, right? Well, prison isn't going to fall in our lifetime. I don't believe that. And then people always tell us that this is ponies and fairy dust. Like, you guys are so ridiculous. Like, you want to get rid of the police. We're doing this survey right now on defunding police, and it's full of people, insulting us, and we need the cops for these reasons and all of that, right? Hilariously, it's like a lot of obvious cops that can't even describe that they're cops, like they can't even hide it, and they're just saying like personally insulting stuff to me. I'm like, wow, you can't even let people live for like 5 minutes without being anti-Black, but like keep going. But no, I always say that, we know that we have to be practical. We have to be practical abolitionists, and we know we ain't ready. If aliens came tomorrow and got rid of the prison, we would just punish each other in other ways, because we haven't even begun to unpack the ways that we punish and blame and harm each other. What people call, Mariam Kaba calls, the cop in our head and the cop in our heart, that we always have to challenge around ourselves. So this also means that abolition has to be, it's not just a set of political principles, it has to be a set of daily practices. So what does it mean to challenge the cop in our hearts? What does it mean to try and heal ourselves? Because we are also harmed, and we are also harmers as a result of our own harm. And so what does it mean to love ourselves enough to heal that, and then to extend that to other people? It doesn't mean that we ask people to forgive, which is, I think, a very gendered thing in particular. Like, women and femme people are like, particularly asked to like, oh, just get over it. Like, there's always an idea of like, there's limited sympathy. And then if you keep going too long, it's like, well, now you're just, now you're just being some kind of way. So it's not about a kind of gendered rhetoric of forgiveness or getting over it. It's actually about accountability. But the only way we can do that is if we work every day in our communities for that. We cannot say we don't believe that people who harm people should be in prison when we won't even deal with the rapists in our friends circles, right? Like, when we have people that we organize with that are harming people, we can't even step to them and say, what's up with that? And then we think we're going to be able to handle like more serious issues of harm. So what we have to do is begin to practice that in our daily lives. So how do we punish each other? How do we heal each other? What does accountability look like? How do we hold other people accountable? How do we hold ourselves accountable? And we can do that work, and we do it in all kinds of ways, through organizing, like when we organize as tenancy groups and maybe cook together, we're forming something else. When we have wine with our friends and talk about like sexual violence with them, and maybe start a healing group. Those small moments that we have as we move through our lives in our communities, in the spaces where we are, because abolition like doesn't have to be, and this is why I was saying about Randy's church, we don't have to have a million books and a million theories. We just have to understand something about living with each other and what it means to make community. Something that we understood to a certain extent during COVID, because like people had to bring each other groceries, and people went and sat outside windows to visit each other. Like, we know how to do this. We have these practices. It's actually not a fantasy. One of the things I actually have started rejecting is this idea of we're only imagining a new world. People often say, imagine the world you want to see. And I don't object to that, but I also want to add to that, it is not imaginary. It is a world that actually exists. It is a world that exists when we can get 41% of people out of jail, which is not an ending, but it's a start, and it shows us something about we actually can release, and that is real. That is not pretend. And also not pretend is all the ways that we actually can take accountability and heal in our own communities and love each other through that. So whether that's, forming a tenancy group, whether that's, just banding with the people to patrol your community so you don't have to have cops, whether that's like, sharing food, like you have a garden and you actually just give it to your neighbors, whether that's like sharing childcare, whether that's like, whatever it is, like whatever act you can think of, that I believe can be an abolitionist act if we're using it to build something else. So.
Thank you. That was a great answer. And yeah, that it feels good to know that and be, I guess, a little bit validated, because I think a lot of people, like you were saying, they think it's just this expensive rhetoric and you don't understand, but you just have to live it on a daily basis and just build up your community and just allow that to be the base of everything. So thank you. And
something I think about quite a lot is like our own desires, right? That we live in a capitalist consumer society that wants us to desire things, and it's hard, I love, like, Leanne Simpson has this thing where she talks about, of course I want the likes, of course I want all the prizes, like, of course I want these things. Everybody wants them, but, like, am I willing to maybe not do the kind of writing I want, to do those things? She talks about this. And like, I think about, what does desire mean to abolitionists when we're told that, we should have the house and we should have the title, we need these things, and to fight against that and to ask ourselves, what is it that we really need? And this is like the internal battle I go through all the time, where I mean, I just got a full-time job, but, I was precariously employed, and I would, cry and think, why can't I get, like, why am I starting, why can't I pay my rent? Like, why am I living like this? And I would have to remind myself constantly, as a constant commitment, that it doesn't matter what those people think about you. What matters is those people in prison who are in solidarity with you, but it's hard. It's not an easy thing, but I think also challenging our own desires. Like, why do we want the clothes and the house and the title and the this and that and the public acclaim? And does that work against what our goal towards each other can and should be? So.
Chanel, you're next up.
Thanks, Bronwyn. I was going to put my hand on my chest to be like, my turn, and I realized that's just my own language. So thank you so much for speaking and for sharing all of that. And every time you were like, I'm talking too long, absolutely not. Like, everything was so informative. I even have a little note saying, take your time, this is so valuable. And I didn't send it because I didn't want to distract you. So thank you for everything you shared, for people's stories. I was hearing so much come up when you were sharing during your talk with us. And I'm wondering if you can share further into the idea of like how risk and intimacy intersect with like abolition, or abolitionist approaches to everyday life. When you were talking about risk more specifically, was like, we're going to lay down on the tarmac. And I think risk can look like a lot of things, but oftentimes when we're met with, and throughout your discussion, it was, if I were to challenge the receptionist on my outfit, I get denied, or something could happen to my friend. If I challenged, him exiting in his orange suit with chains, something could happen. And it's often like we're always met with like this wall. And so I think to meet that wall, there's risk. Can you maybe tell us more about the risk and the intimacy within abolition?
Well, part of the privilege we experience as those of us who live in freedom is the risk is not really ours, right? So what we think of a risk is like, oh no, someone might talk badly about me online. The risk is being shouldered by the people who are inside, right? Like, the risk of transfer doesn't come to me, it comes to them. The risk of being retaliated on the guards doesn't come to me, it comes to them. And, one of the conversations, I'm always trying to default, I'm always like, are you sure? Are you sure you want to use your name? Are you sure you want to say this? They'll probably know it's you. They track the calls, like, I'm often trying to be protective, and people are saying, no, I want this done. I want this said. And so often, and like, when you talk to the woman, you say, how did you find the strength to come forward and challenge this guard? And they'll say, because there's other women. Because everybody says that, like, over and over and over again. Like, the women will be so generous with each other, and they will constantly say it didn't matter what the risk was to me, because there were other people experiencing that, because some other woman may be looking, because some other woman's experiencing this. And by the way, I know I'm sort of talking in binary terms, like I'm only saying men and women. So I just want to pause and say, like, obviously there are people who are incarcerated who are neither men nor women. There are non-binary people, there are gender divergent people, there are men in women's prisons, right? Like trans men. So like, I just don't want to create the idea that there's only like two groups of people. And of course, this is part of like the intimacy problem of prison itself, right? Like, which is, so, so I mean, part of it is the risk that I don't think I'll ever run a risk that's like unshoulderable. And I think it's reminding ourselves that, somebody's at the center of this. Every time we fight for human rights, there's somebody whose rights are being taken from them and is like living with this. So, I guess, I don't know if that's a best answer, but compared to the risk that people who are inside are taking, I think we have the immense privilege to choose that risk, right? So we get to make the choice to do it or not. And we get to make the choice to say if we can't, right? Like if I'm like, I just can't take this on right now, I can say that. They don't get to say, can't take this on. So I guess like, I don't get pepper sprayed tonight. I'm just don't have the capacity to get pepper sprayed tonight. Like that's not an option. So, and then risk is balanced by solidarity, right? And this is where the profound relationships that people have with each other is important. Like abolition is also relationship building. It cannot take place in a singularity. It can't take, if it's just you or just that person is nothing, like that's not going to take you anywhere. So in that practice of building together, and this is what I kind of meant when I was talking about Abdul, right? That because we had taken that on together, and it's not like we didn't dispute. There's times when Abdul was like, are you guys just doing this because you want to be in the media? Like rightly so. There was times where he was like, what is this to you? Like, like where he would ask those questions. The first question he asked me is, why do you do this? Like, what do you get out of this? That was like literally the first question. Do you think you can be successful? And he's right to ask those things. But, as we work through that and build the love that we have and build at slow pace, that kind of trust and relationship, then that's what you rely on when you're taking that risk in. But, and it doesn't seem, I would say that it's hard, but it's easy, that you're choosing something difficult, but I don't know that the choice can be anything else. That it's quite easy to say, if I have the ability in my hands to stop a deportation, would I take it or not? If I have the ability to even make somebody's life a little less, whatever it is, like, do I need to buy coffee every day, or can that money go to someone's canteen who needs it? And I think those are actually easy choices. I think we make them seem harder than they are sometimes, but they are dependent upon our level of privilege. So I also want to say that, it would be unfair to suggest that, everyone's capacities are in the same way or look the same. Like, some people cannot do things because they are living with chronic illness, because they are living in poverty, because they are living with anxiety, because, there are many, many different, you're not able-bodied, right? Like, there are many ways that we sort of frame activism in a very ableist, like, way that, that, oh, well, you just like, suck into your strength and just pull up your strength. You just like find your strength and courage. And it's like, it's not everybody has that same ability to do that. So I don't want to suggest that like there's some kind of glamorous or glorification in like taking the risk, and that person becomes more courageous and then this other person over here doesn't, because there's just many different ways of engagement. Like, it's reasonable if you have child welfare at your door to not do anything in order to save your children, right? Like that's not an unreasonable decision. I don't know if I'm answering this well. I don't know if there's something you want to say. You're probably more insightful than I am on this. But
this is completely a moment of like learning for me. So hearing your perspective brought in so much of what I think that could be binary in itself. So like hearing your answer, I'm going to say this, even though it's recording, lights a fire under my ass. So thank you.
Rebecca.
It's me. Okay, yeah, this actually is a pretty good segue because I have just been thinking a lot, and this is kind of open to other panelists too, interested to hear what other panelists have to say. But just thinking about like how we organize in these conditions, and like, I don't think I'm alone in the kind of widespread and like extremely profound burnout and exhaustion that I'm finding in myself, but also in organizing spaces. It just feels like it's sort of, we're fighting on so many fronts, and it feels like a bit of a repeated assault against kind of in any way, in any direction you're looking, you're kind of met with resistance, or you are resisting. And I guess I'm just wondering or opening a discussion up to like, how do we take care of each other while still caring for those on the inside, like amidst this sort of like pandemic conditions. But like Ellie, you said, like, this is like normal plus a disease, like nothing of the conditions of the pandemic should be surprising. But yeah, how do we kind of care for each other in these really intense times?
I want to leave the other people on the panel jump in. I don't want to talk all the time.
I wanted to add a question to that, like, because this idea of risk and the binary between inside, outside, when we're talking about prisoner solidarity, like becomes a little more diffuse and maybe different when we're talking about police abolition work. And in terms of like who is policed and who isn't, and the degree to which we're all kind of subject to policing, but of course not equally and not in the same way. I wondered if you had thoughts about that, like about the distinction between prison abolition, police abolition, the through lines, the implications for organizing, and solidarity, and then also keeping Rebecca's question center about burnout.
Well, I mean, in terms of like self-care, I'm not the first to say this, but the goal is to build mutual care structures, right? When people care about the people that, we're fighting with, then they will care for them too. People don't care for us because we care for people that people also don't care for, even less than they care for us, right? So, it's not about, like part of what's happened right now, and I'm like guilty of this because I benefit from it, is this idea of like celebrity activism, right? That there has to be these one leaders, and that, our model of protest is there are people at the front, and then there are the bodies that we summon to be our audience, and then when we don't need them, they should go away, and that is not actually organizing. it's mobilizing. It has its role. There's a really important role of mobilizing because it gets people who have never been present. You know, you learn things, it brings us out. Showing presence is actually really important. Like, even if it's raining, I care enough to come out. Like, there's an important thing here. But of course, there has to be something sustained past that, right? And I think we very much fail in this moment about doing that second piece. We're good at mobilizing and we're difficult with organizing because it's hard, right? And that's the space where there's the conflict, where you know, end up fighting with each other, where people get on each other's nerves, or this person's getting more media than the next person. There's, you know, all of that comes in and that everybody deals with. And this is partly where we need to, you know, like, this is where transformative justice is not separate from abolition, right? There's a reason why people say the two go hand in hand, because if we are not practicing how to have conflict with each other and how to heal that conflict and how to work on ourselves in that way, we cannot, again, call for abolition. We're not able to practice the things that are abolitionists. But I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm probably the worst person to ask on like burnout and care, to be honest, because I'm just kind of like a do it until you die person. Like, I'm just like, just do it till you collapse, you know, and then like, you know, eat an edible and get back up and then get to it. But that's not like necessarily like sustainable. And like I said, many people literally do not have physical capacity. Like, it's not, you can't just say to somebody, you know, just come out and do it, you know, and you're like, I actually like live with chronic pain, you know, like that's a different matter. And so the answer is that we have to find our own capacities, what they are, and we have to learn to work with that together and communicate that. And then, you know, we have to bear that mutually, because when we're doing it mutually together, it's not one person. If that one person needs a month or a year, or they need to step back, it shouldn't be a problem, because we should be constantly building each other up. But the problem is we get attached to this idea that like our work is our ego, and we're all like this. You know, this is my work. I was the first person to write about this. Everybody's an abolitionist now. I was like an abolitionist 5 years ago, you know, right? Like, and we become guarded about our work. And especially if we're like a woman of color or a femme person of color, it's because so much of our work is taken from us and appropriated and stolen, and we don't get credit for, and that's very personal. But we have to understand the work is beyond ourselves. We have to understand ourselves as joining. I think a long line of people have done this work, joining. You know, I always find it powerful just to picture my ancestors handing me things, you know, think, you know, I'm joining something that they left for me, you know, like that they did not jump overboard of the ships. They did not jump off the cliffs. They survived, and they imagined the freedom for themselves, right? That what is abolition but somebody was enslaved, like imagining that I will continue my line because at some time I cannot see, but I can still believe in that person might be free, you know? So I think we hold on to that, you know, this purpose that is beyond us. And I think it's very much getting beyond yourself, getting beyond your own, and it's very hard, getting beyond your own like ego, your own desires. And then, you know, really just if you work with other people, then that burden is halved. It sounds cheesy, but that's really what it is, you know, that like the times where you know just are despairing, and then you know somebody just gives you enough to keep going, and also relying on like those small victories, right? Yes, I mean, I spent 4 weeks trying to get a guy eczema cream in jail, and I mean, like, I had to call his lawyer, he was a migrant, like there was no doctor. I mean, the amount of work, because this guy had a skin condition, you know, just to deliver on that. And I was actually able to deliver on that, as opposed to when people have parole problems and call you and like there's nothing you can do because the parole board is just the parole board, you know? So like you often feel completely useless. But then people will say to you, well, at least you picked up the phone. And you're like, well, I have higher standards for the work than that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to just like pick up the phone. I want to help. But I find those expressions so generous and just so caring, and reminding us that, you know, we just have to try. Like, we just have to do what we can, and we're not going to succeed. The prison is not going to fall in our lifetime. Not every deportation can be stopped. Not every conviction can be quashed. You know, like sometimes you cannot get somebody anything, but you can pick up the phone and talk to them and listen to them. You can be loving. And then I'm always amazed at how like how little people expect. You know, like one time a guy called me and I had missed the call. Like, we had set up the call, I kind of like forgot about it. And then when he had to call back, and I was like, the first thing I want to say is I'm really sorry. Like, I know it's hard to get the phones. Like, I apologize. He said, I've never heard anyone apologize to me. So that's something, you know? And I was like, wow, you know, like, but of course, like, why would you, if you're in a prison, who would apologize to you? So even just those things, I think can remind us that these little things that we feel that, you know, maybe we're not doing enough, that it is enough, you know, we just have to do what we can in the moment. So I'm like a bad person to ask, but then I guess, yeah, I think that trying to build that mutuality, and then like, you got to have crew, you got to have people around you, like whether that's the 3 people that agree with you or not, that love that we have, and we have a special love when we work together. Like, there's something powerful about that love. that you really share a real solidarity, and that you know that these people would go to the wall for you, you know, that these people would lie down for you, and then that gives you strength too. So
I think that you summed everything up really, really well. I think the only thing that I would just have to add just more to Rebecca's question, I think the demands that organizers felt all of last summer across Canada it's causing everyone to feel a little bit of a drain out, because there was so much demand to produce. But we also have to take a step back as people in this space and be like, we can't function the same way that our society is functioning, whether it's in the prison system or just in our day-to-day lives. We can't expect us to always be producing and never be healing and never be resting, because then we're not doing anything different and we're not creating a different system. We're not changing the way that we operate. So how can we tell people to change the way they operate? And this has been a big thing for me, but just not taking on more than you can handle, and making sure what you take on can be super well done and is always supporting community first. And then the burnout is much less, or it's easier to control.
Definitely. And like in terms of, yeah, like as you said, this idea, like one thing when I first started doing prison stuff, I get so upset at everything, a visit would be canceled and I would cry, I'd be like, oh, like I planned this visit, and like I'd miss a phone call and I would just sit there in anxiety. I can't believe I missed that call, and I like couldn't relax until the person called back, and it might be like hours later or the next day, and I'd just be stressed. But you can't live like that, so I had to learn. I used to cry like going to work, like literally just drive and cry and then go to the bathroom, like, it was a lot. But then, I had to learn to manage that, like stuff like with Randy. It's like life is long in two ways, right? Life in prison is long, and the life we live is long, and trying to take, I guess that is something that prison work, for good or for bad, kind of has given me, that you have to learn that patience, like when Sean McDonald from Innocence Canada said that to me when Randy was convicted, and I called him like, crying, and he was like, yes, once that lock closes, it takes many, many years to turn that key, and that's true. But we just have to every day try and move towards that space, and it's long, but we have to take that long view. So then I often think like, when I'm dead, no one will care about the mistakes I made, like, the people that hated me will get over it, like, so there's a comfort in like the long view, right? Like I will one day be like dust and it won't matter anymore. And I find that quite comforting in particular ways, but, yeah, it's not going to happen tomorrow. Like we're not going to see like massive results. We fought Abdul and we were really happy. And then the next year we were fighting the exact same case with somebody else, like the policy hadn't changed. So you can be depressed that we're back there, or we can at least feel like, well, at least we learned how to do this the first time, and we can share that with other people. But, we have to have that patience with ourselves and with time, and like really try and ride it out. And that's true for the people inside too. I know there was a question about police. I don't know if other people want to jump in. My thing with police, just really briefly, is like the problem with the police thing right now is how that has been appropriated by all kinds of like neoliberal forces. I've been writing a lot about Black North Initiative, which people aren't particularly happy about. But, like one of the things I've been saying is how in the last year did we move from talking about state violence to talking about business and entrepreneurship as our major concern? Have you noticed that? That we went from cops knelt on George Floyd's neck and we need to like stop the police to we just need to give millions of dollars to businesses. And that doesn't mean Black women braiding hair in their kitchens businesses, right? Like let's not lie about what we mean by businesses. We don't mean, single mothers taking care of each other's children. We mean like business. And I'm like, how do we suddenly switch this capitalist frame? And then I look at a group like Black North Initiative. For those of you who aren't Black and don't pay attention to these things, it's basically like a pledge that corporations signed. They're going to end anti-Black racism. And those corporations include Enbridge, of course, responsible for criminalizing Indigenous people, like Kinross mine that kills Black people around the globe, like many mining and oil companies that kill and criminalize Indigenous and remove Indigenous and Black people across the globe and in this country. Fairfax Financial, which is the #1 investor in for-profit bail in the United States. So the racist predatory bail system, they gave $1 million to Black North Initiative to end Black racism, like while incarcerating Black people. So I think we also have to fight that. So one of the things I've been saying is, when did the fight against policing become so neoliberal, right? Like all of a sudden you have people wearing I am George Floyd shirts on Bay Street. And I'm like, that don't work for me. I'm sorry, you're not George Floyd. Like you're not. Like we are all Black, and there's nothing that can remove our Blackness and our heritage from us. But like, I don't actually accept this idea that you can say I am George Floyd while taking money from people who incarcerate Black people. I reject that. So part of the fight on policing that's been so difficult is precisely because when we are successful, this is what happens. When we're successful in creating momentum around a movement, then we get all the ways the movement is watered down, appropriated, like, you know, all the little institutional statements about Black Lives Matter, like all the corporations that claim about racism. So one of the things we have to do in this fight, and that takes a lot of relentlessness, is we have to take that fight back, you know? And like, you get a lot of people saying defunding doesn't mean defunding. It doesn't mean abolishing. Like, it does. It does. Like, we actually do want to get rid of the police. Marion Keba said, yes, we want to get rid of the police. Yes. You know, you're not going to come in, like when you've been thinking about this for 1 minute and tell people been thinking about this their entire lives that maybe we could get body cameras, you know, when we've been there, you know? So I think that's, and this is like the kind of conversation on care too. It's hard because you have to be so relentless, and then people are like, were you never happy? I'm like, no, I'm not happy. I'm not happy, because you're still harming people. But yeah, I think the big danger with the policing fight has been exactly this way, that it's got appropriated into these particular halls of power. And now we have, people on Bay Street claiming they're ending anti-Black racism by signing a pledge while killing Black people with the other hand. And I totally reject that, so.
That's actually a good segue into one of the questions that we have in the question box. You can, I think you and others can read it in full, but it's from Emily Gerbrandt, who is involved in researching prison animal programs in Canada, and I'm just annotating it here. And she's wondering how prison programming and the public-facing rhetoric prisons push out through these types of programs serves to naturalize the prison through its supposed reform. And I think that is also happening with defund police movements, and expand the prison's reach, as she says, both into the lives of folks behind bars and expanding the carceral logic of the prison more broadly.
Well, the person to talk to about this is Calvin Neufeld in Kingston, who has been fighting the new Kingston prison farm. So Calvin is a huge expert in this area. And one of the things Calvin has really been bringing to our attention is that, so they used to have prison farms. And like, obviously, yes, we can talk about anything that is prison. Like, it's always disturbing. And this is always the problem, the abolitionists, right? But on a daily basis, we want to make people's lives better. But that means that we also end up like propping up the prison industrial complex. When I put money on someone's phone, I'm putting money into the prison. Like, I'm propping up the system, but I'm not going to be like, oh, I don't deal with the prison, because then no one can talk to you. So obviously I have to put that money in. So we have to make these kind of compromises all the time, right? So prison farms obviously are in prison, as you said, like this idea that you can somehow create this other space in a prison that's still a prison, but people very much will have stories about being with the animals and how important it was to their healing and how important that contact was. And of course we got rid of those farms, and now they're claiming that they're bringing them back. But they're bringing it back, and it's like commercial goat farms for like goat milk for the baby formula factories in China. Like, that's the farm they're having in Kingston. And those animals are going to be like in basically a prison situation. Like, they're going to be in darkness. It's like mass-produced consumer farm. And then the prisoners are basically like, they're not nurturing the animals. They're basically there to like, manage these animals so that their milk can be like sold off to the same baby formula factories that like had poisonous baby formula. So it's like all over the place. It's just a mess, right? And this is the rhetoric that CSC is using to talk about like how they're creating prison farms. And what they're actually doing is just like incarcerating the animals as well. And I'm not saying that as a frivolous analogy. There's a long history, of course, of the animal rights movement coming up alongside things like the enslavement abolition movement, Black Beauty being an example of that, right? Some of it because people didn't feel like they could talk about enslaved African people and they could speak about animals, but also because animals are workers and animals are prisoners of us in many ways, right? So we can recognize that in terms of our relationship. The best writer on this is Jason Herbal. If you've ever read Fear of an Animal Planet, that is an absolutely brilliant book about how animals understand freedom. And he writes about like animal escapes. So like there's like one chapter on like elephants and, like how like chimpanzees and like primates in zoos, like, organize to get each other out, and they figure out how to like boost each other up so one can escape, that you actually see his argument is that like when you actually analyze stories of like escape, you can see that animals understand freedom. We believe that freedom is a belonging to humans, and animals understand it. He talks about like Tilikum the whale at SeaWorld that Blackfish was made on, right? And like that is a great documentary about incarceration, right? Like kidnapping it's about settler colonial incarceration, right? Separating out the families of whales, being like, we love the whales. The whales like to do tricks for us. The whales love living in a bathtub and then like wearing a suit like you look like a whale. I'm like, you're not a fucking whale. Like, why are you wearing a suit like you're the whale? You know, and then wondering why the whales are killing you. Like the whale doesn't want to be in this bathtub. Like it's a great exploration of both the carceral mentality and how those who incarcerate believe it's for other people's good and even believe that they love those who they're incarcerating. By the way, a rhetoric also that like teachers in residential schools like believe they love the children we're caring for them as well. And this is part of like carceral care, social workers, doctors and nurses who call the police on people in the emergency room. So there's like also a very long historical connection that we can make between our treatment of animals, our denaturing the prison as an environmental disaster, right? The idea that prisons respond to we build prisons in the places where we've destroyed the environment, and then we make them environments where life shall not thrive. Yet you see, you know, people in prison talking about, I'm feeding birds, like they're landing in my cell, and you know, I found a mouse outside and I brought it into my cell, and like prisoners will find all kinds of ways to nurture life, find a plant, you know, whatever they can do to repress that. But yeah, with the prison farm movement, yeah, the problem is, as always, CSC takes something in whatever goodness it has and just makes it into like an assembly line and finds a way to pervert it. And that's what's going on with prison farms right now. But the person to speak to in more detail, Calvin Neufeld, has some really great articles about it. So if you look up like Kingston Prison Farm, Calvin Neufeld, you'll find some really good articles.
So we don't have other audience Q&As, but some nice comments. So maybe we'll do another round of panelist questions, comments, and then
on the panel speak for themselves. I feel like I've talked really a lot. So I would like to hear from each person on the panel. Just, I don't know, just what's on your mind or what you're thinking or the work you're doing. That's what I would like to hear. So not me, you guys, you talk.
Okay, start with Jada.
Okay, well, I'll start. I think that, there's been so much recently, especially just with Justice for Black Lives Winnipeg. A lot of the work that we do, well, the work that we are most recognized for is going out and rallying and protesting, but we've only been around for a year and we've redistributed over $90,000 back right directly into our community. So we do a lot of we do hampers, we have mental health programming, we do just like a lot of community connection work. And yet the only thing that we're recognized for are those rallies. So I guess my question would just be, like you're talking about, the importance of abolition is not for those who are free. So how do we make that transition from only being recognized for this to now being, like you were talking about, it takes perseverance and you just have to keep pushing and pushing. So like, are there recommended ways that are most effective to make that transition from, oh yeah, we're just rallying, we're just protesting, defund the police, people co-opting the message, and then taking it to like, hey, actually get involved, actually do, you know, connect with these people in prison or connect with this prison group who goes and volunteers and does, like, because we have groups like that here. So I guess just how to make that transition in such a time like this. Any panelists have like so because the most recent thing is just like the criminalization of us even just being out in the streets and how it's so heavily fueled by anti-Black racism, and yet it's being disguised as for public safety. Meanwhile, we've had 4 or 5 anti-mask rallies with 200-300 people unmasked, led by Chris Guy, who we know is racist and problematic for other reasons. We've had Palestinian protests, which should be allowed to happen. They've been allowed to happen. We've had our Indigenous community gathering in front of the ledge to mourn those who have died at the hands of residential school teachers and administrators and churches. And yet when we are hey, we also want to come out, we also need to grieve, we also need to protest, we also need to make sure that things are still happening, it's just met with so much anti-Black racism, disguised as care and concern, but also followed up with death threats and being like, I hope you all get COVID and die, what is wrong with you, this is not necessary. And just people not realizing that just because Black death is not being broadcasted right in front of your face, it doesn't mean that you don't need to fight it. It doesn't mean that it doesn't need to happen anymore. It doesn't mean that the police aren't still harming us or causing harm in general. But for me, I just want to thank you, Elle, for sharing specifically about the prison system and how abolition really starts there and has to be grounded in that. Otherwise, there's kind of no point, because we don't know what it's like to be incarcerated. We don't know what it's like to fight the system while actually being a part of the system in that way. So I think that opened up my eyes a lot, and it will definitely be changing the way that at least the groups that I'm a part of will be doing things going forward.
I have a comment that I'm sure will not be super articulate, but just in response to that, Jade, I'm thinking about how both, like, at the same time as centering the voices of prisoners, what I was kind of getting at with that comment about policing and risk being a little bit different is like another connection we have to keep making is the fact that we're all suffering under this system of criminalization, of capitalism, anti-Black racism, settler colonialism. Like, one of the mentalities that's so entrenched in the context of all of these systems is you know, like saviorism, that we're doing activism for somebody else, for freeing somebody else, but like emphasizing the degree to which all of our struggles are connected, and that this liberation is for all of us, and that the work that we do, ultimately we need to be doing it like in order to survive, like for all of us to survive and for our communities to survive and thrive. Yeah, I think striking that balance is important. One of the projects that I've been involved in, but that has stopped in the context of the pandemic, is a prison visiting rideshare project. And just, yeah, like through that, coming to understand the ways that our literal communities and neighborhoods are like the fabric of them is being unthreaded and taken apart by removing people into prisons, and that we can, you know, support the work of building our communities back up by supporting the people who are supporting people on the inside. Yeah, that somehow that's, you know, it's for all of us. It's we all need it. We all need abolitionist organizing. Chanel, if we're doing a rotation, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, again, I feel like I'll just maybe speak to Jada quickly in that, like, this seems to be like one of those walls where it's like we need to meet it with risk, and like, what does that look like? But yeah, I think that involves like brainstorming, community, conversation, and that's endless and forever. Yeah, it's forever ongoing. But as someone who like is in Winnipeg and like has seen and participated in the work of like Justice for Black Lives, I think there's like so much risk and constant like showing up on behalf of like the community that you've created or the collective and how it's expanding. And so I think like that is something that's like growth, if we want to call it that. But I am looking forward to seeing what comes for this next. I think it's become a honkathon. Yeah, so I look forward to seeing what happens there. Something that comes to mind for me just in listening and in our conversation is like that. So prison will not fall in our lifetime, is what you said, Elle. And I know that you work with youth, and like a lot of what I do with like art and art activism or organizing involves like youth to certain degrees. And like I'm the eldest sibling to a parent who has been incarcerated. And so I think constantly about like, how do we involve youth who are going to be continuing the work that we're doing? Like, what does that look like? What are these conversations? How do we make it palatable, but like without watering it down? Like, how do we do these things? When like, do we think the system, like the carceral system, is changing and we need to keep up? Like, what does that look like? What do these conversations look like? Anyone can answer that.
Well, I don't want to take airtime, but no, that's really important, right? That and there's a tendency to gatekeep, right? That you get to a certain point and you're like, oh, I had to work so hard to get here. These youth don't know. You know, so again, it's what I said about, you know, really trying to abandon our own ego in this work, which is like really difficult. But I mean, the youth are more fervent abolitionists than like anybody, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know, like it's like 10, I'm like, they used to be like 50 abolitionists in Canada. Now there's like 10,000, they're all like 18, you know? So, you know, the youth, I think, understand very profoundly that, you know, partly because the youth are being handed a world where they're the ones receiving, you know, like no, like student debt, no housing, like no possibility of ever purchasing a house, you know, like housing in Halifax of all places, it's like 800,000 for a house. Like who can afford that, you know, like Yeah, like, no opportunity to go to school and get an education, like, and toxic drug crisis, like all these things. So I think young people understand very well that this isn't working. I think we have to balance, obviously, like making things, I never think that the reading is inaccessible. I think, and this also is a question of like, how do we sustain ourselves? Our ancestors came before us and left us a roadmap. They wrote things down. Like Frantz Fanon, as he fought a liberation battle, at the age of 27, left us black skin, white masks that he wrote while he was fighting in a war to free his people. If he can write that, we can read it, So, and reading may look in different ways. It may mean some of us reading it to other people. It may be taking quotes and making TikToks on different sections. It may be making Instagram videos. It may be like, we get together and read it to each other. People in prison read these books together. Are prisons obsolete? Like reading Fanon, but I think it's actually really important. Like last summer when I was, like we were having some of the, the difficulties that activists had, I remember reading like, Chris Hani talking in like the 1960s about members of the ANC basically selling out. And he's like, you're all like living in exile, like talking to rich white people. And we're here on the ground in South Africa, like fighting an armed struggle, and I'm like, Chris Hani is talking about this in like 1961, the same thing. I'm like being like, oh, these corporate, right? So like it's already there. Audre Lorde has left us everything we need to know about like political care. Angela Davis exists. Like there are generations of people, Indigenous and Black, that left us stories, that left us a path. So we don't have to do it alone, and we're not alone. And one of the mistakes we make is now saying that reading is beyond us, that's elitist. And I'm like, don't let that belong to the university classroom. It doesn't belong to the classroom, it belongs to us. So we need to take back political reading and political knowledge. Because I think one of the things I do worry about with young people is this idea that like, oh yeah, like we don't want to engage with the text. And I'm like, that's because you have been taught it in this way that it like doesn't belong to you, but it is there for you, written by fellow young people, written by revolutionaries. And we need to, when we engage, so many of these problems we have are like there. When I read Rocky Jones's autobiography, like, I'm like, this is so helpful. Like he's talking about strategy of things like, how do we get a playground in our community? Like everyone was like fighting with each other, and, like Buff being like Black United Front being appropriated out from under them. And like all these issues are being dealt with. And he talks really frankly about it. And it was not just that it was helpful, it was that I felt seen, I'm like, oh, good. Like, I always feel like I may be a petty or bad person. And here's Rocky, this legendary activist, dealing with the same things. It made me feel at home. So I also think for young people, like, don't be afraid of the reading, even if it's like a page at a time. And I don't mean this in an elitist way, like access it in whatever way you can, because our ancestors wrote this down for a reason, right?
I just want to say that I'm really happy that you brought up TikTok, because I think that is such an important tool that like anyone who has access to internet or a cell phone can use, because there are so many, I think you had talked about like different streams of it, but it can become quite niche. And there is abolitionist TikTok, or abolition talk, if that's what we're going to call it. But yeah, I think it's just like a very modern tool that is overlooked for something that could be like really powerful. So thank you for bringing it to light.
Rebecca, do you want to take a turn? I think probably just being mindful of time, what we'll do is have you, Rebecca, have your turn. And then maybe I'll mention these other two questions that came up in the Q&A box, and I'll turn the floor over to Elle to respond to them and to offer closing thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I feel like this might turn into a question, but it also might just turn into like a little bit of a windy road. So bear with me, and I'll be quick. But like, I attended that talk that you were at last week, Elle, with Taking Cops Out of Care. And I've been thinking a lot about like what you were saying about how the cops have like so successfully kind of rebranded themselves, or like, yeah, they've been naming themselves as frontline workers through the pandemic. And like, we have how many accounts of maskless cops entering houses, coming up, spitting on people, and they get vaccine priority, but disabled people were never prioritized. And I'm just kind of thinking about that sort of like against what you were saying at the beginning, where like traditionally like anti-colonial and anti-racist logics have been used kind of against us to like further harm and like make things worse. And that's basically where my train of thought has ended. We've pulled into the station. But
that was my dystopian post-COVID thing, was that this is how cops are going to get their way back into parades, because they're going to hold like a frontline worker parade and the cops are going to be in it. And like, I'm like, that's how cops will get to parade again. That was like literally my last year's dystopian vision. So watch it become true. But absolutely, right? I mean, and like, I'm like, you don't even want to be cops. So you're like, oh, you guys hate cops. I'm like, you hate cops because you don't even call yourself cops anymore. Like, you're pretending to be frontline workers. So obviously you think there's something wrong with being a cop because you don't even want to own what you do, right? But no, I agree with you, right? And particularly what you said around like, yeah, what that means. So yeah, people with disabilities don't, you know, people were treating the vaccine like a moral thing too, right? Like, why should prisoners get it? I'm like, because prisons are sites of infection. And if you don't care about the prisoners, you could care about the workers that have to go in, the staff, right? But people made it a moral thing. Like, so who's most deserving of an injection, you know? And then it's like, healthcare workers are deserving, but, you know, not disabled people, not homeless people, not people living in prison. Like, it's actually about risk, you know? So that's a situation we translated health into like morality, which is not new. That's what settler colonialism has done forever. That's the hygiene race argument, right? That the contamination argument, that's the homophobic argument, right? Like, gay people spread AIDS, and, you know, like they'll make your child trans, and, you know, like that contamination argument just circulates and circulates and circulates. So there's a reason why it reemerges in COVID in a particular way, because that is a settler colonial idea around cleanliness and purity, and, you know, cleaning out the native quarter, and, you know, like indigenous people are primitive, you know, like all of these narratives about, you know, cleanliness versus purity, the thin blue line versus chaos, right? Like, this kind of binary making is very tied to settler colonialism. So yeah, COVID just like brought it in, like, we can't control this, so we'll create a moral narrative, whether that's around hand washing, or like we can like police the wrong people, we can call the cops, you know? So it's not new, it's just, yeah, being reiterated in this moment.
I also just want to say thank you so much for sharing the stories of the folks you know. I'm going to be carrying, and I'm sure everybody else who's been listening will be carrying those stories with us. Yeah, I just really want to thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you. And you can go to whoisrandyriley.com to learn more about Randy's case. We are going to be re-upping on our campaign to try and stop his retrial in October. So please like send letters to the Crown, like the Public Prosecution Office, and ask them why they are prosecuting this case. So that website is a good site just to learn a bit about that case and keep in touch with Randy. So that's whoisrandyriley.com.
So I'm just going to pose these other two questions in the Q&A, and then Elle, you've got the final stage. So from Scott, how do we organize against prison and police expansion from progressive organizations like NDP unions? Many times they use things like workplace safety to justify it. Love that question.
Yeah.
and then from Chantel, Elle, you had talked about our internal COP. I was wondering if you'd be able to expand on how abolishing our internal carcerality and policing amid interpersonal relationships relates to boundaries being replicated in unhealthy and weaponized ways, which furthers the colonial state. And I'm going to mute myself now. Both great questions.
Okay, that last one's Chantal, can you maybe expand on what you meant? Do you mean that like we have to be careful in that differentiating between like boundaries and punishment? Is that what you're saying? Like, I'm not sure I quite understand. It's a really rich question that I don't know if you want to maybe say in the chat. So maybe if you could go in the chat or come on the mic. The first question is easier in terms of like, oh, now I forgot it. I had an answer. Sorry, what was the first question about?
Progressives and workplace safety.
Yeah, I mean, like you see this with the jail, like so in Newfoundland, for example, where they're building a new jail because HMP, there was a number of people who died by suicide, and then they're like, oh, the jail's so terrible. So they want to build a new jail. And that's being like framed as mental health, right? So then if you oppose the building of the new jail, like, oh, you oppose the mental health of people in prison, like the old jail is so decrepit, like that's what's, and I'm like, it's not the environment. Like, yes, that's a terrible environment, but any jail harms mental health. And of course, the new jail is like going to have Braille outside every cell, and like the doors are going to be wide enough for wheelchairs. So, you know, now we can like, you know, incarcerate people with disabilities, it'll be fine, right? So like this idea of like we don't want like our vision of disability accessibility is not Braille outside cells. Like that's not, you know, so this idea of using that. So yeah, it's difficult because this is where stuff like yeah, like jail expansion comes from, well, it would like be a newer, more progressive building, stuff like that. I don't know how we fight it because it's like one of the new frames of neoliberalism. It's also like this word public safety that I rail against all the time, right? This idea that we turn security into safety and who's the public and who deserves to be safe and what we imagine is safety, right? So safety isn't housing people. Safety isn't paying your bills. Safety is policing people, right? And it's part of that same trajectory where, and like cops being frontline workers, like the same trajectory of using this kind of language to mask what's happening, and then people fall for it. So, I mean, the only way we can fight it is by pushing back against it and remaining true to our principles, like no jail expansion, no new jails, because when we build new jails, we fill them. And we saw that with the women's prisons in Canada when we closed down K4W and there was never more than 40, P4W, there was never more than 40 like federally incarcerated women in Canada. We built the regional prisons and now we're over 500, like when we build it, they will come. So, some people are like, oh, maybe we need special prisons for trans people. Like, then we will criminalize trans people and fill prisons with trans people. Like if some people are like, oh, we need Black halfway houses. I'm like, then that will be the most securitized like halfway house and no Black person will ever get to live in community. Like we have to be really careful about these narratives because this is exactly, Michael Jackson, the prison lawyer, tells us that reform is part of the cycle of an institution, that part of how an institution lives its life is it goes into crisis and then it reforms and that actually extends its life. So we have to be really wary of that because reform is just a way to maintain the status quo and we want something different. So what is the strategy? I don't know, like just continue to protest, continue to disrupt the narrative. You have to continue to put out different information. But yeah, there's very much this idea of like people that believe they can salvage the system in these particular ways. And we were all there, but like there's a reason people came to abolition. Like when abolitionists aren't abolitionists because we're like naive about the system. We're abolitionists because we've seen the system. We engage with the prison on a daily basis and we know for that reason it doesn't work, right? Chantal, I was in a healing circle. We talked a lot about boundaries being a colonial leadership move. Yes. I don't know where your question is taking me is I'm thinking about, Naomi Osaka here, right? And like the politics of refusal, where Naomi Osaka is like, I don't think I can talk to the media. I can do this tournament, but I have social anxiety and I'm going to protect myself. And then she got, the tournament threatened her and said like, we're going to fine you. We're going to kick you out. So she said, fine, then I'll leave. And I'm like, that is like the most powerful moment where she just refused. She said, okay, if that's how you feel, I don't need to be here. They never thought she'd do that. They thought they could shame her. They thought they could do all these things. And it also reminds us, especially for Black women and women of color, that whatever people say to you about you should self-care and like nobody means it. They don't want us to have boundaries. They want us to be endlessly available to be exploited. That's what we exist for our labor to be exploited and our bodies to be exploited and for us to love it. And, the only crime we commit is when we say, maybe you shouldn't make a racist joke in front of me. And then we're like canceling them, right? So, but I just found that a really, really powerful moment in the public of this, young Black Asian woman being like, okay, I don't need to be here. Like I can actually just leave. I don't actually need you. And I'm not dependent upon winning your tournament. So I think about that as like a really transformative boundary setting, as opposed to the idea of boundaries between us, like the border, as opposed to like the wall of the prison, right? So as you said, like the settler colonial need to divide and name in their own name and like map, which is a huge colonial tool, and, do all of these things that are around arranging and managing versus what a boundary means when it becomes about like, like a revolutionary boundary. And I see like Naomi Osaka having expressed that, right? That the politics of refusing, of walking away, of not engaging, of saying there's something else and I can expect something else. So it's not a great answer. That's a really, really wonderful question, Chantal. I think we can all think about that further.
So we've got 2 minutes left and I want to be mindful of, Elle, you had mentioned you might want to close with a poem.
I'll do a short poem. How's that?
Okay, we would love that. And I just want to thank all the other panelists and all the attendees and everyone who asked questions and dropped comments. Thank you so much for this, this time, Elle and everyone else. So I'm going to mute myself and turn my video off, and maybe the rest of us can too.
And
Bye.
thank you so much to the panelists and for all the wisdom and work. I really encourage everybody attending this talk to engage with the groups you heard. So Winnipeg Police Cause Harm. Put that back into the chat, all the groups that you're representing, so people can know, and like where can people go to get information or join or support. That's really important, right? Like it's easy to come into a community and speak. The people who are living in your community are doing this labor every day. I'm not living there doing this, they are. So please, let's honor the workers that we had here tonight, the abolition workers, and let them know however we can support. Okay, so this is my take on Goodnight Moon. if people know that poem. In a provincial jail, there's a little room with a toilet and a sink and a smell of mildew, and a slit of a window with a sliver of the moon, and a radio on a shelf playing a tune, and a metal cot, and a metal slot, and a night that's either too cold or too hot, and an officer in the spot by the stairs, and 3 more officers sitting in chairs, and the shadow of the laws that put people in there, and the eye of the camera watching you sitting, and a photocopied picture of your mother and children, and a heart with a hole for the loved ones you're missing, and restless dreams where you wake up shivering, and a door with a lock, and a window with bars, and a corner of the sky showing just 1 star, and a comb, and a brush, and a toilet that won't flush, and a guard on his rounds, ordering, hush. So good night, room, like a little tomb. Good night, window, barely showing the moon. Good night, laws that aren't changing soon. Good night, radio. Good night, news. Good night, cot. Good night, slot. Good night, down in solitary where the world forgot. Good night, sheets tied up in a knot. Good night, bad dreams and regretful thoughts. Good night, clanging doors and the camera shot. Good night, locks. Good night, clocks. Good night, countdown to the day you get out of the box. Good night, mildew. Good night, mold. Good night, lights on all night down in the hole. Good night, heart with its little hole. Good night, heat. Good night, cold. Good night, foam mattress. Good night, comb. Good night to the crumpled picture of home. Good night, dripping sink and toilet that won't flush. And good night to the officers ordering, hush. Good night, patrols. Good night, stare. Good night, outside. Good night, air. Good night, love. Good night, care. Good night, prisoners, everywhere. Thank you, everybody. Take care of yourselves.